She was called useless in court, but when she showed proof changing everything, his pride shattered. The clinking of silverware against porcelain was the only sound echoing in the cold kitchen that morning. Madison sat at the breakfast table, gently stirring a spoonful of oatmeal that had long since cooled. Across from her, Daniel scrolled through his phone, not once glancing up. The air between them felt thick, like a storm cloud waiting to burst. They had once shared the same space in laughter, in dreams, in whispered plans for the future. Now, the silence screamed louder than any argument they had ever had. Without warning, Daniel cleared his throat and spoke with the emotionless precision of a business transaction. "I'm filing for divorce," he said, setting his phone down. "I already spoke to a lawyer." Madison felt her spine go rigid, though her face remained neutral, trained by years of swallowing disappointment. "I see," she replied quietly, though inside, her world was tilting. She had sensed the distance, the absence of warmth in his voice, but hearing the finality of it felt like being cut open without anesthesia. No conversation, no attempt at reconciliation, just a decision made. Daniel stood, buttoning his jacket like he was headed to a meeting. "I need space. This marriage isn't working anymore." As he walked toward the door, she didn't ask him to stay. She didn't cry. Instead, she stared at the untouched oatmeal in her bowl and wondered how long he had been planning this exit. Dinner that night was eerily quiet. Their 8-year-old son, Noah, sat across from Madison, swinging his legs beneath the chair. "Is Dad working late again?" he asked, poking at the mashed potatoes on his plate. Madison forced a smile, the kind that didn't reach her eyes. "He won't be joining us for dinner anymore, sweetheart," she replied softly. Noah blinked, confused. "Like ever?" Madison nodded slowly, holding back the lump rising in her throat. "It's just going to be you and me for a while." Noah's small fingers tightened around his fork, but he didn't ask any more questions. He simply looked down and kept eating, the innocence in his eyes dimming just a bit. After dinner, while Noah brushed his teeth and got ready for bed, Madison stood in the doorway of what used to be their shared bedroom. Half the closet was empty, the absence of Daniel's belongings like a gaping hole. She walked over to the dresser and opened the top drawer, where she used to keep small notes he'd leave her on random mornings, reminders of love once real. It had been years since he'd written one. She closed the drawer with care, turned off the light, and walked out, the emptiness of the room following her like a shadow. For the first time in years, she lay awake on one side of the bed, feeling its other half stretch endlessly beside her. The official court envelope arrived a week later, thick with paperwork and cold language. The return address on the envelope was from a sleek downtown law firm, one that Daniel could now afford thanks to his recent promotion. Madison sat on the edge of the couch with the documents spread before her, trying to make sense of the terminology that seemed intentionally designed to intimidate. Among the clauses and statements, one line stood out with cruel clarity: the petitioner asserts that the respondent has made no significant financial or domestic contribution to the household during the marriage. Madison's hands trembled as she read it again. No contribution. Useless. That's what he was saying. That's how he saw her. Her mind traveled through years of school pickups, home-cooked meals, late-night fevers, and unpaid sacrifices. She had left her job after Noah was born because they had agreed one parent should stay home. She had built that home from within, creating stability, love, and routine while Daniel built his resume. Now, that entire life was being dismissed with a single sentence. Later that night, after putting Noah to sleep, Madison stared at the ceiling of her dimly lit bedroom. The shame was heavy, but deeper than that was the sting of injustice. She had given her entire self to this family. And now, The person she once trusted the most was painting her as nothing more than a dependent. Madison wasn't sure why she had called Eliza after so many years. Maybe it was desperation, or maybe it was the echo of a memory. Eliza, with her thick glasses in college, always buried in law textbooks, saying she'd change the world someday. Madison? Eliza's voice came through the phone, warm and surprised. It's been forever. Are you okay? Madison took a breath and explained everything. The sudden divorce. The court papers. The accusation of uselessness. Eliza listened without interrupting, and when Madison's voice finally cracked, her friend simply said, "Come to my office tomorrow. Don't sign anything. We'll talk." For the first time in days, Madison exhaled without trembling. The next morning, Madison entered Eliza's firm, a modest but tidy space tucked between two coffee shops. There was something comforting about the soft ticking of the clock on the wall and the rows of neatly stacked legal books. Eliza reviewed the documents quickly, her eyes narrowing as she read the claims Daniel's lawyer had submitted. "This isn't just a divorce," she finally said, looking up. "This is an attempt to erase you. And I won't let that happen." Madison felt a surge of something she hadn't felt in weeks: hope. Eliza leaned forward and asked, "Do you have any proof of your contributions? Anything at all that shows how much you've done?" Madison blinked. "I don't know. I mean, maybe. I kept some things." Eliza smiled. "Then we're not done here. Not even close." Court day arrived with the weight of dread. Madison entered the courthouse in a plain navy dress, clutching a thin folder of receipts and old calendars she had found in the basement. She passed Daniel in the hallway, looking polished in a tailored suit, surrounded by a lawyer and his new girlfriend, a striking woman with sharp cheekbones and a colder smile. "Still playing housewife?" the woman muttered as Madison walked by. Eliza placed a firm hand on Madison's back. "Don't respond. We'll speak where it matters, inside." The courtroom was sterile, the judge stern, the atmosphere heavy with tension. When Daniel's lawyer began to speak, he painted Madison as a woman who had sat idle, offering no meaningful support while Daniel built everything from scratch. Madison listened, heart pounding, as the lawyer used phrases like financial deadweight and domestic inactivity. She noticed the smirks from Daniel's side and the indifference of the people around. Her cheeks burned with shame, but she kept her eyes on the judge, steady and silent. When it was her turn to speak, her voice wavered but did not falter. She pulled up the calendar marked with school events she'd managed, the emails she had drafted for Daniel's job applications, the photos of late-night meals she cooked while he worked. Still, she could see the skepticism in the room. It wasn't enough. Not yet. As she sat down, her fingers curled tightly around the edges of her seat. The worst wasn't over, but the fight had finally begun. The house at night became an echo chamber of thoughts Madison tried to suppress. Once Noah had fallen asleep, she'd sit by the kitchen table, staring at the dim glow of the streetlight through the window, her tea untouched, hands clasped tightly together. There was no one to speak to, no conversations to fill the silence, just the steady thrum of a broken heart wondering when exactly the shift had begun, when love had been replaced by criticism, warmth by condescension. The absence of Daniel's voice brought a twisted peace, yet also left behind a hollow ringing that no sound could fill. She scrolled through old photos on her phone, vacations, birthdays, holiday mornings where she stood behind the camera capturing moments rather than appearing in them. Daniel had always praised her for how organized she was, how she kept everything running. "You're the backbone of this family," he once said, but those words had vanished long before the affidavit that now labeled her as a burden. As the clock ticked past midnight, Madison would sit in that stillness, gathering pieces of herself, trying to remember that woman who once believed she mattered, not just as a wife or mother, but as a person who had value even when no one was watching. Noah's 9th birthday arrived on a gray Saturday morning, the kind of overcast that made everything look a little washed out. Madison had decorated the living room with blue and silver balloons, just as he liked. She baked his favorite cake, chocolate with peanut butter frosting, and even dug out his old party hats from the back of the cabinet. She kept glancing at the door, hoping Daniel might surprise their son, might show some semblance of decency. But the hours passed, the candles were lit and blown, and the only person missing was the one Noah asked about in a voice far too steady for a child his age. As the evening wound down, Noah curled beside Madison on the couch, cake crumbs on his shirt and a slight pout on his lips. "Maybe he forgot," he said, not quite asking, but needing her to say something comforting. Madison wrapped her arms around him and whispered, "Even when people forget, you're never any less important." That night, after Noah had fallen asleep beside his unopened gifts, Madison sat at the edge of his bed and stared at the faint outline of her child in the darkness. Her heart ached, not just because of the divorce, but because Daniel hadn't only chosen to leave her. He had abandoned the very soul they once created together. At their next meeting, Eliza sat across from Madison with a stack of paperwork between them. "We need more," she said plainly. "What you've brought is a start, but in this courtroom, emotional labor doesn't count unless you can translate it into receipts, timelines, impact." Madison nodded slowly, the words cutting her with their truth. "He's trying to paint a story where you were along for the ride, not driving anything. And right now, all we have is your voice and a few fragments of the journey. If we want the judge to see the real picture, we need to build the full frame." Madison understood, but it still stung, how something as intangible as sacrifice needed concrete evidence to be recognized. "I didn't document loving him," she murmured, voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't take pictures every time I stayed up with Noah when he had a fever or every time I proofread his proposals." Eliza leaned forward gently. "I know. But let's find what we can. Old bank statements, calendars, emails, anything that shows the structure behind the scenes." Madison left the office that day not defeated, but with a new kind of fire. She was tired of being polite about pain. Tired of apologizing for having given everything. Back home, Madison rummaged through the attic, pulling down old boxes labeled kids' art, taxes, and miscellaneous. Her fingers brushed across folders thick with dust, her mind racing through memories attached to every faded label. It wasn't until she pulled out a weathered shoebox tucked behind a stack of unused curtains that something shifted. Inside were neatly organized envelopes, printouts of Daniel's early work proposals, and notes scribbled in her handwriting, revisions she had made for him over the years. She remembered typing them late at night while Noah nursed beside her. She had done it all quietly, never expecting recognition. Deeper in the box were family budgeting sheets, school event planners, schedules with every pediatrician appointment and therapy session Noah ever had. Everything meticulously tracked. Dates. Times. Outcomes. Madison sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by these pieces of her invisible labor, feeling something crack inside her, not from pain, but from long overdue validation. For the first time since Daniel left, she didn't feel like a ghost in her own life. She felt like a woman who had built something real, even if the world hadn't seen it yet. She took a deep breath, then stood up with the box in her arms. Tomorrow, Eliza would see this. And so would the court. With the box beside her on the desk, Madison and Eliza went through each item like forensic scientists examining a crime scene. Every piece told a story, the PTA flyers she'd helped design, the emails to Daniel's colleagues she had ghostwritten, the meal planning lists with corresponding grocery receipts from months when Daniel's workload was too heavy to cook or clean. Eliza highlighted everything, making annotations in the margins like a puzzle, slowly revealing the full picture. "This," she said, pointing to a timeline Madison had once drafted during Daniel's busiest quarter at work, "shows exactly how he managed to function. Because you managed everything else." They worked for hours, page after page, building a case that was no longer just legal, it was personal. By the end of the day, Madison's eyes were raw from emotion, but her shoulders felt lighter. She had always believed her work mattered. She just never imagined she'd have to fight to prove it. As Eliza packed up the folders into color-coded files, she looked at Madison and said with calm certainty, "He tried to erase your story. What he didn't know is that you kept the receipts. And we're going to use every single one." The night before their next court date, Madison sat at the dining room table, surrounded by folders meticulously labeled and color-coded. Noah had fallen asleep with a book in his arms, and the silence in the house was thick with anticipation. Madison flipped through the files once more, rehearsing how she'd explain years of unpaid, invisible work to people who saw only numbers. She couldn't sleep. Her thoughts moved in loops. What if it wasn't enough? What if her story was dismissed again as emotional noise, as it had been so many times before? Yet for every doubt, a memory surfaced of all the times she held that family together with nothing but willpower and love. At sunrise, she got dressed carefully, choosing a navy blouse and simple earrings, wanting to appear calm and composed. Not broken. She tucked a photo of Noah into her wallet, a reminder of who she was doing this for. As she stepped out the door, she whispered softly, "This is for us." At the courthouse, Eliza met her with a reassuring nod and a binder that looked more like a weapon than a file. "We're not just going to defend you today," Eliza said as they walked toward the courtroom. "We're going to tell the truth he thought no one would ever hear." During the hearing, Daniel's lawyer attempted once again to undermine Madison's role in their marriage, calling her presence in the household supportive at best, but professionally inconsequential. Eliza remained composed as she flipped open a tab in the binder labeled Q3 Project Valor. She laid down a printed email thread from 5 years earlier, one where Madison had rewritten the project proposal Daniel later submitted to win a lucrative contract. She'd saved the original document, showing her editing notes in the margins. It was Madison's language, her structure, her strategy that had landed him that promotion. As the courtroom absorbed the evidence, Daniel's expression subtly shifted from confident detachment to a tense rigidity. He looked toward his lawyer, whispering something, but it was too late. Eliza wasn't done. She pulled out one of Madison's old journals, containing pages where she'd mapped out budgets, coordinated childcare during Daniel's travel weeks, and detailed meeting schedules that aligned with his calendar. While he worked late, Eliza said evenly, she managed the household like a corporation, unpaid and undocumented, but essential. Without her, he doesn't get that promotion. The judge leaned back slightly, as if finally beginning to see the full dimensions of a story that had, until then, been flattened to legal jargon. After court adjourned for lunch, Madison stepped outside to get a moment of air. The day was unusually warm for the season, and the sun felt almost intrusive on her skin. As she turned the corner toward the courthouse steps, Daniel's new girlfriend, Vanessa, appeared from a bench nearby, sunglasses perched on her head and an unlit cigarette in her hand. "You really know how to drag things out," she said with a smirk. "Still playing the victim? Maybe if you had tried harder, you wouldn't be standing here begging for sympathy in court." Madison said nothing, not because she had no words, but because this woman's opinion meant nothing to her. Vanessa stepped closer. "He told me you were clingy. Controlling. Always nagging. That's why he left you, you know. He needed someone who knew how to keep up. Madison's jaw clenched, but her voice remained calm. If keeping up means disappearing when things get hard, then no, I was never good at that. She walked past without looking back, letting the sting of those words settle in the past where they belonged. Back inside, Eliza handed her a fresh bottle of water and whispered, "Don't let noise distract you from the truth. We've only just started." As the court day ended and the halls began to clear, Madison walked toward the parking lot alone, clutching the documents that now held fragments of her life. Just as she reached her car, her knees buckled slightly, not from exhaustion, but from a wave of emotion she could no longer hold back. She leaned against the door, tears spilling over silently, as though her body had reached the limit of strength it could borrow from willpower. She didn't sob. The pain came in stillness, the kind that echoed deeper than any sound. Everything she had endured, every moment of silence and sacrifice, came crashing into her all at once. A man walking by stopped, uncertain. He looked like someone waiting for a relative in the court building. "Ma'am, are you okay?" he asked gently. Madison wiped her face quickly, offering a small nod. "Yes. Just tired." He hesitated before reaching into his pocket and handing her a tissue. "My sister went through something like this. Took her years to get her voice back. But she did." Then he walked away, leaving her with more than just a tissue. In that moment, Madison realized she wasn't entirely alone. Her story, however personal, was shared by countless others. And every tear that fell wasn't just grief, it was release. That evening, Madison sat in her room sorting through yet another file box when she found a small envelope tucked between old bank statements. The handwriting on it was Daniel's. She opened it with caution, unsure what memory might be attached. Inside was a folded letter, dated 3 years earlier, apparently written on one of their anniversaries. "I wouldn't have made it without you," it began. "You make everything work, even when I don't say it enough. I see you, even when I act like I don't." It ended with a promise to do better. A promise that never came to life. Madison read the letter twice, then let it fall onto the bed beside her. She didn't cry. Instead, she felt a strange detachment, as though the man who had written it was someone entirely different from the one in court trying to erase her contributions. The letter was never given. It had sat buried, forgotten, like her efforts, her sacrifices, her voice. And yet, in its own ironic way, the letter was proof. Not of love, but of acknowledgement. Madison picked it up once more, slipped it into a clear sleeve, and added it to the growing binder. It might not change the case, but it told the truth. He had seen her. He had known. And still, he chose silence. Now, it was her turn to speak. Noah had started asking questions Madison wasn't ready to answer. He had noticed how cold Daniel had become, how visits were missed without warning and promises broke like fragile glass. "Why doesn't Dad want to come to my soccer games?" he asked one evening, voice flat, eyes distant. Madison knelt beside him and cupped his face gently, searching for words a child could carry without wounding his heart. "Sometimes adults make mistakes," she whispered. "But you are not the reason for them." He nodded slowly, accepting her truth, though clearly still hurt by the silence of a father who once cheered the loudest from the stands. That night, after tucking Noah into bed, Madison sat by the window staring out into the dark, her reflection barely visible on the glass. She realized that this wasn't just a legal battle for dignity anymore. This was for Noah's understanding of what love and responsibility should look like. She didn't want him to grow up thinking women had to disappear to be worthy, that kindness should be rewarded with abandonment. He was watching her every action, every word. And if she didn't fight for herself, she'd be teaching him that erasing someone was acceptable. That was a legacy she refused to leave. The next hearing day brought a surprise no one anticipated. As Madison prepared her notes with Eliza, a voice behind them spoke her name. She turned to see James, Daniel's older brother, standing just outside the courtroom door, looking slightly unsure of himself. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" he asked, eyes flickering with something that resembled guilt. Madison followed him into the hallway. "I don't agree with what he's doing," James began. "You held that family together. We all saw it. Even when he didn't." Madison blinked, stunned by the sudden support. James had never interfered before, always keeping his distance. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out an old envelope. Inside were photographs, holiday gatherings, and a thank you note Madison had once written for a surprise birthday she had organized for Daniel. "You deserve to be seen," James said quietly. "And if I can help you make that happen in court, I will." That afternoon, Eliza called him as a witness. He testified not just to Madison's character, but to the countless ways she had uplifted Daniel, mentally, emotionally, and professionally. It was the first time someone from Daniel's world acknowledged her without conditions. And as James stepped down from the stand, Madison met his gaze and nodded, silently grateful for the truth he had chosen to share. The judge, who had remained mostly expressionless throughout the proceedings, began asking sharper questions. "Mr. Reynolds," she said during Daniel's cross-examination, "you've painted a picture of your ex-wife as absent and dependent. Yet evidence has been presented indicating she managed every aspect of your domestic life, supported your career, and was the primary caregiver for your son. How do you reconcile these contradictions?" Daniel shifted in his seat, clearly caught off guard. His lawyer attempted to intervene, but the judge raised her hand. "No, I'd like to hear his answer." For the first time, Daniel hesitated. The confidence he once wielded so effortlessly now cracked around the edges. I guess I didn't realize how much she did," he mumbled. "It was weak, unconvincing, and insufficient." The judge nodded slowly, scribbling something in her notebook. "It's not uncommon," she said, "for society to overlook the work that's done quietly. But in this courtroom, we deal with facts, and the facts show a woman who carried more than her share." Madison sat quietly, heart pounding, watching the balance shift ever so slightly. It was subtle, but powerful. For the first time, someone with authority had called out the distortion. The truth, so long ignored, had finally begun to breathe. When court reconvened the following week, Eliza approached the bench with a sealed envelope. "With the court's permission," she said, "we would like to submit this final piece of evidence." The judge gestured for her to proceed. Inside the envelope were pages Madison had compiled from Daniel's own company memos, drafts she had typed, structured, and even rewritten at his request. Her name wasn't on them, of course. It never had been. But the original emails, with Daniel forwarding her edits to his colleagues, left no doubt. The correspondence was time-stamped, dated, and preserved. Proof that she had shaped far more of his career than he had ever admitted. As Eliza presented the material, Daniel's face went pale. He leaned toward his lawyer, whispering furiously, but there was no undoing what had been submitted. The courtroom was silent, the tension palpable. The judge flipped through the documents slowly, eyes narrowing with every page. Madison didn't feel triumphant, just vindicated. Her hands trembled slightly in her lap, but her back remained straight. She wasn't there for revenge. She was there for recognition. For the truth to be spoken, finally, without fear or shame. The defense tried to recover by painting Madison's actions as typical spousal support, something any good partner would offer. But Eliza stood and countered with unshakable clarity. Are we to believe, she asked, that unpaid labor, executed at a professional level, should simply be expected and then discarded? That her silence should be used against her? The room fell still. She turned to Daniel and asked, "Do you recall ever compensating her for those contributions? Ever crediting her in your achievements?" Daniel shifted again. "We were married. It wasn't a transaction." Eliza's tone sharpened. "Yet here we are, in a courtroom, because now that marriage no longer serves you, you call her worthless." The judge raised an eyebrow, clearly absorbing the gravity of that exchange. Daniel looked away, unable to meet Madison's eyes. His silence echoed louder than any denial. When the court recessed, Madison walked slowly into the hallway, not triumphant, but grounded. For years, she had lived in the background of someone else's story. But now, with every word, every document, every step forward, she was writing her own. When the court resumed that afternoon, Eliza returned to the center of the room holding a document thicker than the others. "This is a compiled ledger," she explained, "of the hours Mrs. Reynolds spent in unpaid labor supporting Mr. Reynolds's career, based on the documents we've presented. It equates to more than 28,000 hours over 10 years. Gasps echoed faintly through the gallery. The judge glanced at the first few pages, then leaned forward slightly, more attentive now. "Each entry is sourced," Eliza continued. "Every meal prepped during business trips, every report reviewed, every doctor's visit scheduled. This is not emotional guesswork, it is a timeline of labor that allowed Mr. Reynolds to rise." Daniel looked visibly rattled for the first time. He reached for a glass of water and his hand trembled just enough for Madison to notice. Her breathing was steady now. She wasn't angry, not anymore. She had something far more powerful, clarity. Eliza rested her hand briefly on Madison's shoulder as she returned to their table. "This," she whispered, "was always yours. We just helped them see it." The ledger sat on the table between them, weighty and irrefutable, a physical manifestation of years of devotion turned evidence. For the first time since this began, Madison saw the tide turning, not with force, but with undeniable truth. The next exhibit was unexpected even for Madison. Eliza pulled out a USB drive and asked permission to play a short video. The judge nodded, intrigued. As the courtroom lights dimmed slightly, the screen at the front came to life. A home video played. Noah, no more than 5 years old, standing in the living room with a handmade card in his hands. "This is for Mommy," he said proudly. "Because she always makes everything okay." His small voice filled the courtroom, innocent and unscripted. The card read, "To the best mom who keeps our family together, even when Daddy is busy all the time." Tears formed in Madison's eyes as she watched that moment, long forgotten, now reborn in a place that once made her feel invisible. Daniel stared at the screen, his expression unreadable. When the video ended, the room remained silent, as though no one dared disturb the emotional weight it had delivered. The judge cleared her throat, her voice a little softer than before. "The court recognizes this as character evidence. It demonstrates perception within the family unit." Madison sat still, her fingers laced tightly in her lap, heart heavy and full. Noah had seen her. Even as a child, he had known her worth. The next round of questioning hit Daniel harder than expected. Eliza calmly began listing contradictions in his earlier statements. You claimed your wife never contributed financially. Yet here's an email from your former manager thanking her directly for a financial planning spreadsheet she created. Care to explain that? Daniel stumbled over his response, muttering something about collaboration and shared ideas. His lawyer tried to redirect, but Eliza pressed again. You also mentioned she never supported your work directly. Why, then, do you reference her input in 3 separate employee evaluations? He shifted in his seat, discomfort written plainly across his face. By the time Eliza was done, Daniel's confidence had cracked open. The once composed man who entered court weeks ago with his chin held high now struggled to maintain eye contact. His responses grew shorter, his tone more defensive. Madison sat watching, not with vindictiveness, but with a quiet resolve. This wasn't about his failure, it was about her truth finally being acknowledged. As the judge called for a recess, Daniel left the courtroom quickly, avoiding her gaze. Madison stayed seated, eyes steady, hands calm. The lies had lost their shine. There was nothing left for him to hide behind. When the hearing resumed, the judge folded her hands on the bench and looked directly at Daniel. Mr. Reynolds, she said, if your ex-wife contributed so little, why does every milestone in your professional life coincide with periods of intense involvement from her, based on this evidence? Daniel opened his mouth, then paused, clearly searching for a response. The courtroom felt frozen in that silence. I underestimated her, he finally said. I guess I didn't realize how much she was doing behind the scenes. It was a weak admission, too late to be noble, but revealing in its own right. The judge nodded slowly, then turned to Madison. Mrs. Reynolds, the court recognizes your extensive contribution to the household and to your husband's professional advancement. Your labor was consistent, measurable, and indispensable. Madison's throat tightened, but she remained composed. Eliza gave her a subtle nod. The judge's voice remained firm. We will be issuing a judgment reflecting that reality. And just like that, the story Daniel had written alone was no longer the one that would be remembered. Madison hadn't shouted, hadn't begged, she had simply told the truth and allowed it to rise. As word of the case spread in legal circles, the final day drew a small audience. Law students, junior attorneys, even a few family law advocates filled the back benches. Eliza leaned toward Madison before the final statements and whispered, "They're not here for him. They're here for what you represent." Madison nodded, absorbing the magnitude of that shift. She had walked into this courtroom weeks ago feeling like an afterthought, and now people were watching to learn from her courage. Daniel, on the other hand, looked smaller than ever, hunched slightly, his sharp suit now ill-fitting on a man stripped of pretense. During closing arguments, Eliza didn't just summarize the evidence, she painted a full picture of the human cost behind unpaid labor, behind invisible sacrifices made in silence. She spoke not just for Madison, but for millions of women who had ever been made to feel disposable after years of devotion. As she finished, the courtroom remained hushed. The judge gave no final remarks, simply stating that a written verdict would follow. But in that moment, Madison didn't need more words. The silence itself was powerful, it meant they had listened. She walked out not with vengeance, but with dignity restored, carrying herself like someone who had finally stepped into the light. The following week brought an unexpected moment. The judge had approved a private session with Noah, guided by a court-appointed child therapist. A video of his statement was presented during the final proceedings. On the screen, Noah sat in a softly lit room, holding a drawing he made. "This is my mom," he said quietly. "She always makes things better. Even when Dad forgot, she didn't. His voice, small and clear, carried more truth than any affidavit. He didn't cry. He simply told the truth the way children do, honestly, without malice, but with impact that settled in the room like a weight. The video ended with Noah saying, "My dad used to tell me that my mom was our hero. I think he just forgot. But I didn't." The silence that followed was not awkward, but reverent. Daniel looked down, visibly shaken. No one said a word. It wasn't necessary. Madison held her breath, feeling a kind of emotional release she hadn't known she needed. Her son had seen her. Through all the noise and injustice, he had never lost sight of who she was. And that was the kind of victory that no courtroom could measure. The courtroom was quiet when the judge returned with her written decision. Madison sat upright, hands clasped in her lap, her eyes fixed forward. The judge began to read. After thorough review, the court finds that Mrs. Reynolds made substantial, documentable contributions to the household, both in support of her husband's career and as primary caregiver to their child. The judge ruled in favor of joint custody with primary residence granted to Madison, along with a financial settlement recognizing the unpaid labor she performed over the course of their marriage. Daniel showed no emotion, only blank resignation. Madison didn't smile, nor did she cry. She simply exhaled, a long, slow breath that felt like the end of a chapter she never asked to write. As she exited the courthouse, Eliza walked beside her, silent at first. Then, with a small smile, she said, "You didn't just reclaim your voice. You changed what it means to be seen." The sky was clear, the afternoon light soft and golden. Madison looked up and let it wash over her. It wasn't the beginning of the end. It was the end of invisibility. In the days that followed, Daniel sent a single email. No apology, no acknowledgement, only a suggestion that they reconsider financial terms for mutual convenience. Madison didn't reply. She had no need to re-engage in the same cycle. Word soon spread that Vanessa had left him, tired of the fallout and unwilling to be tied to someone who had lost more than just a legal case. He had lost his sense of self. Daniel's reputation within his professional circle faded. What once looked like confidence now read as arrogance. The mask had cracked. Madison didn't celebrate his downfall. She simply didn't carry the weight of it anymore. While he tried to rebuild an image that never truly belonged to him, she was busy building something far more real, a life rooted in peace, truth, and self-worth. She had spent years shrinking to accommodate someone else's success. Now, she stood tall, not above him, but apart from him. Months passed. Madison enrolled in a community college program focused on business and organizational planning. She started a small consulting service helping women balance home management and career goals, sharing the same strategies she once used invisibly. She and Noah moved into a modest home with a small backyard, where they planted vegetables on weekends and read on the porch in the evenings. Life was not glamorous, but it was genuine, and every part of it felt earned. She no longer measured her days by what she lost, but by what she created. There was a calmness to her routine now, morning walks, quiet dinners, shared laughter. One day, while sorting through some old notebooks, she wrote a simple line on a fresh page: "I am not defined by what someone failed to see in me. I am defined by what I chose to build in spite of it." It wasn't a quote, it was her truth. 1 year after the final ruling, Madison was invited to speak at a conference focused on recognizing unpaid labor in domestic life. She walked onto the stage in a pale blouse and black slacks, simple and steady. The room fell silent as she took the microphone. "I was once told in court that I contributed nothing," she began. that I was simply present. But the truth is, presence is power. And what I gave wasn't invisible, it was simply uncredited. She continued, her voice unwavering. To every person who has ever been told their worth depends on what others can measure, remember this: what you do when no one is watching often matters most. Don't let silence rewrite your story. As she stepped off the stage, the applause was immediate and lasting. Noah waited backstage, arms crossed proudly. "You were amazing," he said, wrapping her in a hug. And in that moment, Madison realized her greatest victory wasn't justice, it was being seen, heard, and believed.